Welcome to Off the Page. I'm Will Cain with Jonah Goldberg, who's nice enough to jump on with me at the last minute from where, Jonah?
I'm in historic Galesburg, Illinois, where I believe Ronald Reagan attended third grade.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, hey, Jonah, you were pretty honest this morning and said that you've been engaging in a little bit of wishful thinking. Specifically, you wrote, when the Times Square story first broke, there was a part of you that said, man, I hope that's not some white militia nut job. And you said when you saw the news this morning that it was a Pakistani man, a small part of you was relieved. Why? Why were you relieved?
First of all, it's always better, it seems to me, that if you're going to be attacked in a terrible terrorist attack, that it should come from your sworn enemies abroad than from homegrown domestic terrorists.
Okay.
But also, look, I don't think anyone can really deny that we live in a very messed up, polarized climate where people are looking at these incidents to fit a narrative. And I think that the domestic threat narrative that you hear so much of from people like Frank Rich and others is a really dishonest narrative. It is an overhyped narrative. It's an ugly prism through which to look at America. That doesn't mean that there aren't really dangerous nut jobs out there, but we are in the middle of what is still a war on terror with Islamic extremists who are sworn to attack America, that we are expending immense amounts of blood and treasure fighting.
Yeah, so Jonah, you went on though, and you said not only did you hope it wasn't some white militia nut job, but that you suspected, I'm going to emphasize suspected, that the other side was hoping it was that they had the opposite hopeful dread that you had. Why?
Well, I think it's sort of transparently obvious that I don't think that I'm not speaking with a broad brush to say every liberal, and I'm not saying that even the worst liberals, the worst transgressors of this on the other side of the argument, that it wasn't any bigger, but a small part of their brains too. But I put this thing up in the corner from this MSNBC anchorwoman who basically articulated exactly what I said. Contessa Brewer, I think is her name. That these guys really don't like this war on terror stuff. They don't like the idea that there are actual real live terrorists out there who pretty much all happen to be Muslim, who are attacking America and justifying this, what they think is an unreasonable right-wing fear-mongering against, Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorists. And so I think it's just simply out there. And I think a lot of people are watching these events, unfortunately, and I'm trying to be honest and pleading guilty a little bit of it myself, like it's some sort of movie or
right.
chess game with moving parts. And I think that's an unhealthy environment. But I don't think it's a matter of moral equivalence between the two sides. I think mine is the more reality-based position. We used to hear all so much about the reality-based community. I'm the one who's actually looking at groups like Al-Qaeda and sundry other groups that are fighting us in Afghanistan and Iraq and all around the world that have sworn to kill Americans. And I say, gosh, I don't want anything to muddy the waters that takes us away from that legitimate threat. Meanwhile, the other side is saying, gosh, I really hope there's something that muddies the waters that takes our eye off that legitimate threat. I think those are two very different positions.
Yeah, and you definitely are making clear that you feel like their position is the worst one.
Yeah, well, it seems it's obvious that it's the worst one. I mean, the idea that somehow, and it feeds into this, this larger argument about, the Tea Parties and the backlash against Obama and healthcare. You had Michael Bloomberg with this, profoundly asinine comments about how he thought it was someone who was just mad about the healthcare bill.
Right.
There is this deliberate attempt that we saw from Barack Obama in his Michigan commencement speech just earlier this week to sort of insinuate that any full-blooded opposition to the Obama administration is providing at least rhetorical aid and comfort to this violent domestic threat at home. You had writers for the Daily Beast, Frank Rich, talking about how an almost trivial number of asinine actions by a handful of overzealous right-wing nuts, basically throwing bricks and leaving nasty phone mail and email messages, was tantamount to Kristallnacht and the rise of Hitler. But when those things happen to Republicans, oh, well, that's just the background noise and the hurly-burly of American politics. People need to go back and read Leo Rebuffo's, essay on the Brown Scare. This is something that's deep in liberal DNA, to constantly suggest that opposition to progressivism is really, a stalking horse for some sort of nascent domestic fascism. And it is a bullying tactic that I find both factually idiotic, but also sort of morally repugnant and profoundly undemocratic.
And more common, I hear you saying, than one would think.
It's all over the place. I mean, it's almost impossible not to find. You can't open up, magazines like Harper's or something, or you can't read the Sunday New York Times op-ed pages without finding, or the Washington Post op-ed pages, without finding someone who was at least, insinuating in some snide way that the real threat comes from honest American citizens who, by the way, are arguing for limiting government and shrinking the size and scope of the federal government. I don't understand how people can't grasp that Nazism was not a libertarian movement.
Right.
And yet there is this knee-jerk need to sort of delegitimize criticism from the right. And at the same time, it's amazing. Look, we have this liberal industrial complex from the Janet Napolitano memo on down that is willing to describe vast swaths of the American public as in league with terrorists. But the second that you point out that, like, Barack Obama was friends and professional colleagues with Bill Ayers, who was an actual domestic terrorist, to point that out means you're a birther and a kook and a weirdo. It is a very weird thing that you can have wholesale slander of millions of Americans, and that is just what the reasonable people of the New York Times do. Right. But you actually point out a real living connection between the President of the United States and an actual domestic terrorist. That's proof that you're a nut job. It is a bizarre cognitive dissonance out there.
Well, and Jonah, the argument will come back to you, and the argument I'm sure will be made that you're coming from a polarizing perspective as well, that you're painting the opposite side as soft on terrorism, unserious about Islamic terrorism, and not fit for leadership, essentially, to be addressing that kind of threat. Don't you think you'll hear that, and how would you address that?
Well, I'm sure I'll hear it. You wouldn't believe the things I hear every day. And, look, if you're going to get boiled down to personalities, look, I think that criticism, if people are going to take it as a wholesale criticism of all of these people in government, then I think that would be a fair criticism to throw at me. But if we're talking at the level of national discourse about how the political argument is framed by, like, people like Bill Clinton, who did his whole his whole Oklahoma City bombing is consistent with the Tea Party movement stuff. Right. Then if we're going to talk at that level of generalization, then I think it is a perfectly fair thing to say that mainstream liberal democratic voices are in the business of smearing vast numbers of law-abiding, decent citizens who are engaged in the democratic process as somehow, brown shirts.
Right.
And I don't think, just because I'm going to hear from people who take offense to that, doesn't mean it's not true. And all I can do is simply say, whether it sounds polarizing or not, that these are the facts as I see them. And if you see other facts, please point them out. I am not disputing that there are idiot nut job, white militias out there, but their ties to the Republican Party are essentially non-existent.
I got you. Your argument back is, you're right. But I'm right. I'm accurate.
Sure. I'm right. Yeah, I guess that's my point.
Okay. Listen, I got to run. Thanks for doing this on such short notice, and good luck tonight.
Sure thing. Thanks.
Okay, man. You can find Jonah at nationalreview.com. Follow me on Twitter at Will Cain. See what interviews are coming up. Thanks, guys.